I'll just let everybody know that this gathering is being recorded and it is also being streamed. So just FYI. Again, welcome and thanks for putting in the chat a little bit of something about you, your name, where you're coming to join us from, and maybe why you're here with us today. For those of you just joining us, welcome. And just a reminder to share a little bit about yourself in the chat so that we get a sense of who is with us today. So happy to see you all. And we'll be getting started in just 1 or 2 minutes. I wish I could hear all your voices and feel the energy in the room, but the beauty of us meeting virtually obviously is that we get to be with people literally from coast to coast to have this important conversation. So that is the advantage, and I'm just super grateful for the collaboration of my LaSallian consortium members from various institutions. So we'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. I'm going to repeat this at the end, but thank you to Chris Swanson and Elizabeth Sartell on my end for helping with the background of all the electronics and technology and whatever. So just a shout out to them because I could not do this without them. So again, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. I think quite a few more people probably will wander in the next few minutes, but that's okay. We just have a very limited time and we want to make sure we take full advantage of it. So welcome everyone to today's Interfaith Forum. And it's been organized for the first time ever by what we're calling the LaSallian Consortium for Interfaith Dialogue and Diversity. And today's specific event is entitled Healing Generations of Faith-Based Anti-Blackness. My name is Dr. Christy Billups. I'm an associate professor of practice in theology and peace and justice studies and the director of the Brother Jeffrey Grow Institute for Dialogue, Justice, and Social Action. Shout out to his sister, Sister Joy. I saw her on here, so glad you could be with us today. This gathering is the first of its kind in that it was organized with the cooperation of the U.S. LaSallian universities through this entity I just named, the LaSallian Consortium. Representatives of these LaSallian institutions of higher education are collaborating to ensure that interfaith dialogue and work to foster interfaith cooperation toward justice remain a priority for the entire LaSallian community. In a moment, I'll introduce our forum panelists. But before we do that, I'd like to invite Dr. Christopher Bobier of St. Mary's University of Minnesota to offer an opening reflection to get things started. Dr. Bobier.
Thank you. In line with our LaSallian heritage, let us begin by remembering that we are in the holy presence of God. I'm going to read a prayer for racial healing from the Catholic Charities USA. God of justice, in your wisdom, you create all people in your image without exception. Through your goodness, open our eyes to see the dignity, beauty, and worth of every human being. Open our minds to understand that all your children are brothers and sisters in the same human family. Open our hearts to repent of racist attitudes, behaviors, and speech which demean others. Open our ears to hear the cries of those wounded by racial discrimination and their passionate appeals for change. Strengthen our resolve to make amends for past injustices and to right the wrongs of history. And fill us with courage that we might seek to heal wounds, build bridges, forgive and be forgiven, and establish peace and equality for all in our communities. Saint John Baptiste de La Salle, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bouvier. This afternoon, our forum is intended to be dialogic, to bring our varied stories and experiences into the conversation and to value the insights of all persons here today. In order to do that, we ask that all participants observe the guidelines and values that were sent to you after registering. And for those of you who did not receive those, it is intended to ensure a safe space for deep listening and sharing of story in a respectful exchange. Thank you for offering respect and listening deeply to the stories and perspectives of others as the conversation unfolds. Additionally, while we recognize and honor that many persons and communities have been marginalized and or demonized at numerous times in our nation's history, today we will be focused in particular on the impact of various faith communities, their teachings and practices on Black persons and communities. In other words, our complicity in anti-Blackness across religious histories. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce all four of our panelists, and then I will offer the prompt for the first sharing that they'll be sharing with us. And so it is an honor to introduce first Dr. Menazza Freidy. Dr. Freidy is a professor of religious studies and director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College. She teaches courses on Islam, the Holocaust, genocide, comparative religion, and feminism. Her recent book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, by Academic Studies Press, was nominated for the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. Thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Courtney Bryant. Reverend Dr. Bryant currently teaches womanist ethics at Manhattan College and serves as the pastor of Righteous Relations at All Angels Church in New York City. Her first book, Erotic Defiance, A Womanist Ethic of Freedom and Resistance, is currently slated for publication with Fortress Press in the fall of 2022. Congratulations, Dr. Bryant. In addition, Dr. Bryant produces content and curricula for a variety of church denominations on topics like justice, relating righteously, power, and spiritual development. Welcome, Dr. Bryant. Dr. Laura Frank. Dr. Frank is full professor, I might add, of nutrition in the Department of Urban Public Health and Nutrition at LaSalle University in Pennsylvania. At LaSalle University, she has been a member of the Interfaith Strategic Planning Task Force and the Campus Anti-Racism Working Group, and participated in multiple regional and international LaSallian anti-racism programs. Welcome, Dr. Frank. And finally, Dr. Maureen O'Connell. Dr. O'Connell is professor of Christian ethics in the Department of Religion and Theology at LaSalle University. She is a member of POWER, Philadelphians Organizing to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild, an interfaith coalition committed to making Philadelphia the city of just love through faith-based community. She is also a member of the President's Commission on the Legacy of Slavery at Rosemont College. And I'd also like to add that our topic today and the themes that it will foster emerged from her recent publication of Undoing the Knots, 5 Generations of American Catholic Anti-Blackness. And so we're very grateful for the wisdom she has shared in that book and the idea for having this very vital conversation. And so, again, welcome all, and thank you so much for being here. We want to begin now. So the first question we will ask our panelists to respond to is this: how has the faith tradition to which you belong colluded or been complicit in anti-Blackness in the United States? And we will start with Maureen and go from there. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. I'm starting my clock. I want to say a big thank you to Christy and Menazza and Francis for organizing, coordinating this, and a thanks to all who are here, especially my students, some of whom just left the classroom that I am in now and are joining us. So I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to talk about this and also to lift up female colleagues here at the end of this Women's History Month to talk about this really important topic. So I think this is wonderful. So I think I'm just going to really quickly explain my understanding of anti-Blackness, inviting colleagues to contribute as we go, and then show a couple things that I discovered through looking at my family history since 1820 in Philadelphia. So basically, I understand anti-Blackness as something that is at the heart of American racism, and it's linked very closely to our history of slavery and Black enslavement. Theologian Katie Grimes, and I'll put something in the chat about her to direct you to her, suggests that we may have abolished slavery, but the link between Black people and servitude, between Black people and danger, between Black people as being somehow less human than white people persists in our American culture. So anti-Blackness, just a very basic definition. So how did my faith tradition contribute to this? I looked over the history of my family and the Archdiocese of Philadelphia over 5 generations, and I noticed 3 patterns that I recognized as anti-Black as I started to do this research. First, the institutional church, and by this I mean the hierarchy of bishops in the United States, practiced a preferential option for the institutional church over the people, over its members. So at different points in the history, in parishes that my family were in, the church could have moved towards Black people seeking their own liberation, towards creating an integrated common good, and chose not to in the name of protecting the interests of the institutional church. The second thing I noticed across my history is that Catholics, white Catholics, tend to take a missionary approach to understanding racial inequities. So the racial inequity that race has created, white Catholics tend to respond with a missionary response. That means we tend to see racism through an interpersonal lens rather than through a structural one. We see people who have been made poor because of race through the lens of need. We're failing to see them through the lens of assets. And failing to ask why this structural inequity exists in the first place. And then lastly, because I've got 7 more seconds and we can talk more about this, I saw patterns of my white Catholic family's comfort being prioritized over the growth and a commitment to justice of the Catholic communities to which they belonged. So white comfort was prized over things like racial justice. So those are 3 patterns that I saw in exploring my family's history that I came to recognize as being anti-Black, distinctively Catholic and anti-Black. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. O'Connell. We'll now move to Dr. Bryant for her comments.
Thank you so much. And again, I just want to thank everybody for allowing me to be a part of this panel, and for those of you who showed up. It's a wonderful thing to see you in the place. And this is important stuff that we're discussing. As I think about my own experiences of anti-Blackness in a Protestant context, I have to go back to my first church, and fascinatingly enough, it was a multicultural church. I went to the Church of North New York. It was a congregational church in the Bronx that was founded in the early 1900s. And when I came on the scene in the 80s, not to date myself, it had gone from being a white church to being a multicultural church. And it was interesting how we see anti-Blackness sort of creep in even prior to white flight, right? Because we know there was a great deal of white flight in the 70s and 80s. But I know that as a child, as a very, very young child, I remember the resources that were put into the music ministry and the kinds of cultures that were celebrated. My mother had this beautiful soprano voice, and she was able to sing with the chancel choir or the senior choir. And as a young person, I remember watching all of these wonderfully melodic songs come from her voice and from the choir's voice. And I felt as though it was so beautiful. It was so wonderful. And the way that they would capture it and also have lighting all set for it. You know, it was set, the stage was set for a classical experience. In contrast, there was a gospel choir, a sort of ragtag bunch who unfortunately were under the direction of that same chancel choir music director. And I gotta say, he didn't really have the range to offer them what they needed to sound good. So as a young person, it was the classical music that sounded amazing. And those in that choir were typically white people who could read music. And my mother happened to be in that choir because of her wonderful voice. She was not in the gospel choir. The gospel choir didn't sound great, as I said, because of the music minister who didn't have the range. And so as I reflect on it as an adult, I realize that this is a question of an allocation of resources and making sure that particular kinds of culture are pedestalized while others are sort of relegated to the side. In addition to that, there were the stained glass windows, and you guys all know where I'm going with this. Jesus was white. And so in my moral imagination, even to this day, it's still difficult to rid my mind of a white Jesus when we know that Jesus was in fact Middle Eastern. At 12 years old, we traveled to Bethesda Baptist Church in New Rochelle, New York. We became Baptist, and we also started worshiping in a Black church. And as a result, we saw a shift in the ways that Black culture was celebrated. The gospel choir was the thing to be, while the chancel choir now struggled. And so it was interesting to see that allocation of resources. But interestingly enough, that same white Jesus remained on the stained glass windows of the Black church house as well. Again, so we can't escape from a moral imagination where God is white. And this shows up in tremendous ways, and I can see I'm almost at time. This shows up in tremendous ways, particularly in the ethics of the church that I grew up in the sense that despite the fact that there was a celebration of Black culture and Black music, Black bodies continued to be perceived as, if not inferior, definitely in need of surveillance, definitely in need of the kind of tightly wound ethical purview such that Black people had to ensure that they were above reproach when it came to our sexualities, when it came to how we dressed our bodies. And respectability was the order of the day. And when I say respectability, I mean comporting oneself in a way that made white society take notice and accept the bodies that we presented. So in those three ways, ethics, images, and the celebration of particular cultures, anti-Blackness was certainly proliferated in my church experience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryant. Dr. Frank?
Okay, so thank you all again for being here. And I do want to mention that, as you might have heard in the intro, I am not a religious scholar. So unlike my colleagues here, I'm largely going to be speaking from my own experience and what I have been told and read rather than a scholarly work. I wanted to start out by acknowledging that in the United States, in the early history of the United States, there were Jews who were slaveholders. There were Jews who participated in the slave trade. And I feel compelled to acknowledge that, although it wasn't the major contributor, we did have a part in that. I'm going to focus a bit more on the modern era. There's always been a bit of a tension between the Jewish community and the Black community around discrimination and othering. As everybody's aware, certainly the Jewish community has been targeted by many of the same folks who target Black people. And how do we deal with that? Well, we have a very mixed response to it. Sometimes it's provoked empathy, support. Other times, though, I feel that it's been almost used as a cover, as maybe an excuse for our own anti-Blackness, and say, well, we've been on the receiving end, so we are innocent. We cannot possibly be complicit. And I'm very disturbed by that, because I do know that in my own families, my elders of my families, I've heard some very disparaging talk directed towards Black people. There's a word that is the equivalent of the N word in Yiddish, although it technically translates just to Black. It's certainly not used that way. Jews have been targeted by discriminatory practices such as redlining, but also participated in those practices. When Jews were business owners, were property owners, they may have had restrictive covenants directed at them, but then they wrote them into their own property deeds. So it's a very complicated relationship when you look at that. I think I forgot to start my timer. I'm very sorry. So I'm not sure how much time I actually have, but I did also want to mention that we have Black members of our synagogue. And I find that it's a very uncomfortable position for them sometimes when they're in the congregation celebrating. Are they really members? Sometimes people ask, why are you here? You know, or who invited you, rather than assuming that they are members of the congregation. So it's just a very complicated, nuanced relationship, joining with, and yet also in sometimes feeling excused from having to be accountable for our own anti-Black implicit biases and our own history. So I don't know if I'm out of time, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frank. And Dr. Freidy.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So I'm going to start my timer. So I just want to start with saying that I'm South Asian and I'm an immigrant to the United States. So for me to think about the United States is also very different, being an immigrant and a Muslim and a South Asian. But I wanted to share some facts and some theoretical issues that we can think about. Most African Americans in the United States are Christians, but some are Muslim. In fact, as of 2011, while most Muslims in the United States were immigrants, 63%, most native-born Muslims were African American. African American Muslims have been part of the fabric of the US from the beginning, but their position as a dual minority in both race and religion has often made them an object of discrimination. The first Muslims in America were brought by force, and it is known that 15 to 20% of enslaved Africans were actually indeed Muslims. And there's a very interesting story about that, which I teach in my Muslims in America class about. But I also wanted to say that we are, as most religions, experience a lot of amnesia, because amnesia to me means that we forget really what we are taught in our religious faith. For example, the Quran states that we have created you all out of a male and female and have made you into nations and tribes so that you may come to know one another. Verily, the noblest of you in the sight of Allah is the one who is most deeply conscious of him. Behold, Allah is all knowing, all aware. In the hadith, Prophet Muhammad said, O people, your Lord is one, your father Adam is one. There is no favor of an Arab over a foreigner, nor a foreigner over an Arab, and neither white skin over black skin, nor black skin over white skin, except by righteousness. Have I not delivered the message? Unfortunately, we have not taken heed of the message. For example, in 2015, there were 3 Arab American students who were murdered, and it was a huge media event. A lot of Muslims came together, raised money, gave charity, because that's what we do when people die in our faith. However, just shortly after, there was a brutal murder of Abdussamad Sheikh Hussein, who was a Somali Muslim, and it was completely ignored. And then in 2015, there was a spike over Freddie Gray murder, our African-American brother. However, the Islamic Society of North America called Black Lives Matter basically disturbing and wanton destruction, although they changed that statement. So put it simply, within our own community of diverse Muslims, South Asian and Arab American Muslims have a race problem. To understand the extent of that problem, you have to look no further, but look at how Black Americans, especially Muslim American and Black Americans, are treated by their own community. And you can find that in mosques, you can find that in community gatherings, and the segregation that has been created in terms of looking at these different racial lines within Islam. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Freidy. Thank you all for all that wisdom and the insights to ponder. So thank you so much. The rest, our participants, you'll be glad to know we're going to hear more from our panelists, but we wanted to spend some time, 10 relatively short minutes, in breakout rooms exploring a related question to the one that our panelists just answered. As I share the question aloud, my colleague, Dr. Sartell, will put the questions in the chat. The question or questions are as follows. What experiences with or observations of anti-Blackness have you had with the faith tradition in which you participate? Or if you are on a LaSallian campus, how have you experienced or observed this on your LaSallian campus? So again, what experiences with or observations of anti-Blackness have you had with the faith tradition in which you participate? And or how have you experienced or observed this on your LaSallian campus? Again, I ask all participants to please recall guidelines and values for respectful dialogue. Each breakout room will have a facilitator to guide the conversation. We'll send a reminder toward the end of your time together for each group to return to the main room with a question for the panelists or the community at large gathered here. If you could please, when you get when it says join the breakout room, if you could just jot down which breakout room you're in. That way, if for some reason the internet pops you off, we'll be able to put you back into the room you were in. So please make a note of that. I hope you will have a very rich dialogue, and we will see you in about 10 minutes. Oops. Those of you who are streaming this, if you could just give us one moment, we're going to share a clip with you. The individual that was going to introduce it went into a breakout room, so I will do my best. Shortly after the murder of George Floyd, there was a gathering of LaSallians to discuss Black lives and valuing Black lives more fully as LaSallian communities. And so what we're going to share in this and in the subsequent breakout room time are clips from that gathering. And so this first one is an opening remarks from Brother Ernest Miller, one of the members of the LaSalle University community. So for your pondering.
Thank you,
Valuing
Francis.
Black lives more fully as LaSallian communities. And so
We are living
what we're going
in
to
a
share
historic
this
moment.
and in the subsequent breakout room time.
The
Pause it,
wave
pause.
of public
Clips from
outrage
that
and reaction.
gathering. So this first one is an opening remarks from Brother Ernest Miller, one of the members of the LaSalle University community. So oh, because it was streaming, it's delayed. Here we go. Thank you, Chris.
Francis.
Black lives more fully as LaSallian communities. And so
We are living
what we're going
in
to
a
share
historic
in
moment.
the subsequent apologies to anyone who's streaming.
When many people aspire to heal the nation and expand the quest for democracy, human freedom, and human dignity. This struggle requires frank discussion of the dimensions of human freedom and dignity, mercy, love, courage, resistance, imagination, empathy, all of which are part and parcel to building a better world. We watch crowds of people of every age, skin color, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, and no religion take to the streets to cry out against deep-seated structural anti-Blackness. The racist ideology that emerged out of American slavery still persists, framing Black people as dangerous and likely criminal. It shows the distorted moral narrative of our democracy, which we must play our own part in deconstructing. We cannot abide a world in which Black mothers and fathers must, as a matter of course, educate their children in how to survive an encounter with the police. We cannot accept a society that tells Black youth, you are worth less than, your life is cheap. At present, our society is in the depths of anguish and despair, what Martin Luther King Jr. calls the disjointed elements of reality. In this broken place, our nation needs to heed the ancient wisdom of the Hebrew prophet Zechariah. Take inventory of yourself. Publicly own the deep wounds and painful consequences of oppression and suffering in the land. Zechariah calls us to become prisoners of prophetic hope. We must shift from pleasant poetics of charity to a prophetic praxis of hope, capable of transforming the status quo. It opens up the possibility to create a movement that enacts transformational justice. That is to say, a movement that brings about the fruits of the reign of God. But what exactly is the problem against which we must dedicate ourselves to struggle? At the opening of the 20th century, the great sociologist and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois asserted, The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. This analysis remains desperately relevant today as the nation continues to be affected by the fumes and odors of systemic structural racism in American democracy. We have ingested the idea, says Resmaa Menakem, that the white body is the supreme standard of humanity. While we see anger and violence in the streets of our country, the real battlefield is inside all of our bodies of every color. Menakem continues, if we are to survive as a country, it is inside our bodies where this conflict needs to be resolved. That the vital force behind white supremacy is in our nervous systems. If you don't understand this truth, everything about this moment will confuse you. Everything about racial inequities, poverty, and social unrest will confuse you. Let us pray that God will keep this knowledge close to our hearts. After registering for this event, you received a copy of the mission-mandated vision for racial justice. Take an opportunity to consider this document and offer comment and suggestions about how we move forward as a Lasallian community, locally and globally, towards enacting racial justice on a personal and communal level.
For those who have stayed in the main room who are streaming, we'll be underway again in just one moment. Thanks for your patience.
Oh, now my picture's up. No.
Chrissy, I'm going to send you something really quick in the chat just to alert you to it, okay?
Okay.
Great.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope the conversation in the breakout room was rich. I know it was very brief, so thanks for going with the flow. And we will have another opportunity for questions from our participants. I'd just like to remind the small group facilitators to please place your question that emerged during the conversation in the chat. And if you didn't get to that this time, that's okay too. But let's see what we can entertain at this time that will continue to move our conversation forward. So again, facilitators, if you can put your questions in the chat, that would be great. Or even if it didn't get put in the frame of a question, a highlight from the conversation that seemed to emerge as particularly important. Well, I'm going to go ahead and grab the first one just to take full advantage of our time together, and because it is a rich question as well. And the question is from Elizabeth, and for her group, she asks, what are some productive ways to call in others to witness trends of anti-Blackness within our traditions or on our campuses? And any of our panelists who would like to begin with a brief comment in response to that question. Again, what are some productive ways to call in others to witness trends of anti-Blackness within our traditions or on our campuses?
I'm willing to speak about something that actually Maureen and I were both involved in within my synagogue, where we decided to do a training for the board and brought in Maureen to help us facilitate. And we asked people to just think about their own experiences growing up where they had noted anti-Blackness. It may perhaps had not been noted at that time, but now is revealed to them as such. And remember places and experiences where they or their family members may have experienced or perpetrated anti-Blackness in their own business practices, in their own dialogues, conversations, and making it very personal and having small breakout rooms where people could be open with each other was, I think, very helpful to facilitate that dialogue. And Maureen, I don't know if you want to make more of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Laura. I mean, I think it's an excellent question. I think that, and maybe this jumps us to one of the things that we'll end our time with, but one of the contributions that I think faith traditions can make to this work is precisely that move to calling in rather than shaming and calling out. And I think in our Lasallian tradition, we have this really neat notion of together and by association. So we could be walking different paths toward around the same mission, oriented towards the same good. And that, you know, the work of justice calls us to continually re-invite people to that work rather than shaming people for what they've not done or calling people out for the wrongs that they've done. And unfortunately, some of our traditions have done that as a response or as a way of creating racial justice and equity. And I'm not so sure that that works. Our faith traditions have unique ways of inviting people. And that, I think, is something that we can continue to do.
Thanks, Maureen. Courtney, did you want to weigh in?
Absolutely. Toward that end, I definitely think that dialogue is important. And I think that creating an atmosphere that is not one of shame is super important. And one of the ways that my current congregation at All Angels has done that is that we have developed listening circles. Oftentimes when we're talking about anti-Blackness or racism, we're talking about very, very sensitive topics where people are sometimes not willing to share for fear of what the response will be. And so sometimes it's necessary to take the pressure off. And so what that church congregation did is they had a series of listening circles, very similar to what we're doing here, except the people would share their various experiences of anti-Blackness and racism within the church and beyond. And they were invited to share it, but there was no response in the sense that we took those stories in, We reflected on them. We did some really strong and intentional listening, and then came back the following week after a time of reflection to see what had sort of bubbled to the top. And initially, as an African American, I got to tell you, I was not a fan of this. Like, the idea of it was like, listen, there are urgent things going on. My community needs help. I don't need you guys sitting and reflecting. But once we did it, I found that it was incredibly life-giving. It was exciting to hear that people who didn't look like me were thinking a lot of the things that I was thinking. And I think that it was important for each participant, as I said, to have that time and space of reflection, because oftentimes when we speak, we're thinking about what we're going to say in response, but allowing those stories to wash over us and then to come together and collectively lament was extremely powerful. So the dialogue is important, but extremely important within that dialogue is that time and space for listening without judgment, and for listening and to allow it to sort of marinate within you.
Wholehearted agreement, Courtney, with the listening and peace and restorative circles. Menazza, something very brief about this, because I just want to touch on one more question before we go to our next formalized question.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to address the question of agency, because the language really disturbs me. Like, we calling it in, how should we integrate? I think that sometimes it's almost like, this idea of understanding the other. It's not really up to us, right? I mean, there's some things that are not up to us. Like, for example, when I talk about post-colonialism, there was no narrative of the Native. It was just gone. So it was invisibility, and that's really important for us to think about. We can't fix problems, and I think that once we take that we become the agents of dealing with anti-Blackness, we're actually turning it around, reversing it into a racism. So I want us to be really careful about how we talk about that, because it's essential in many areas in terms of anti-Blackness itself. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you so much. What I think I'm going to do is just sort of highlight this, and if there's any way that the panelists could tie in, I think there were a bunch of really powerful questions in the chat, and hopefully people had a chance to look them over. But one of the ones that stood out for me was from Francis Sweeney's group, that it seems that this work is primarily the work of white members of our communities. How do we help ourselves get to the level of necessary discomfort? And I thought there was a lot of really interesting ideas baked into that question. And I, Courtney, I'm sure you noticed the shout out to your own story of your mom and the music within the church and how that's been impacted by anti-Blackness. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward to the next formal question. But again, if our panelists in any way could tie in that idea of discomfort into your answers, that might be very interesting and helpful to keep moving deeper. And so our question for this round is, why are interfaith dialogue, and emphasis on interfaith, right? Interfaith dialogue and cooperation essential in promoting racial justice? Again, why are interfaith dialogue and cooperation essential in promoting racial justice? And this time we're going to start with Courtney.
Thank you. So interfaith dialogue is incredibly important just because it allows us to draw together the various ideas that we have about God, and particularly those that are common to all of us and the way they rise to the top. I am thinking particularly right now about the Imago Dei, right? Which we know is a foundational principle in Christian doctrine, but we also see it in Sufi theology. We see it in Jewish theology as well. And so these become, wow, having an eye problem. These become resources. I'm going to close my eyes so that I can continue to talk. But these become resources that we can draw upon when we recognize that we are all created in the image of God, and we recognize where this is seen in the various traditions that we come from. This becomes a starting point. Well, how do we honor the image of God in each of us? And how do we continue to contest the degrading ideas of our lives not mattering or lives being of less value based on some kind of racial hierarchy? But I also want to encourage us to consider past dialogue, because oftentimes my white brothers and sisters, and it's through no fault of their own, because this is the way we've been socialized and educated, but oftentimes my white brothers and sisters assume that just because they have spent time reflecting on a thing, that that has somehow contributed to making that thing go away. And that's not necessarily always the case. At this point, I want to emphasize or lift up Sean Copeland's work in Fleshing Freedom, where she talks about the importance of doing things differently, showing up in an embodied way and living differently. So while I do think that it is incredibly important for us to have interfaith dialogue, I think it is also incredibly important for us to have interfaith experiences and interactions, because I feel like within those experiences, particularly when they're across the racial divide, that they offer us an alternative, if you will. If we look at experience and we think about the ways that it shapes our moral imaginations, the racial divide, particularly anti-Blackness, is so deeply steeped in our communities and in our society that oftentimes we don't know how to imagine in a different way, right? It's virtually impossible. Like, what do you mean a place where everyone gets along or where everyone is valued equally? That doesn't exist, and how could it possibly exist? But I think that when we begin to move past dialogue and into interactions and experiences across the racial divide and an interfaith experience and interaction, that provides the fodder for new faith and new opportunities to imagine differently.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure I speak for everyone with how impressive it was that you keep trucking and you didn't lose any train of thought while whatever was in your eye was making you crazy. So thank you so much for really lots to think about. And I'm going to shift to Laura now.
Okay. And this time I have my timer on. Okay, so I want to talk about an experience of interfaith dialogue that my synagogue engaged in. We actually have a church immediately across the street from us. It's a Episcopal church, which has quite a diverse membership. We decided to have an interfaith Seder. You may be aware that Passover is coming up soon, and Passover is the narrative of the release from slavery and the journey of the ancient Hebrew people fleeing Egypt. And we talked with the church members about, could we do a version of this that addresses the Black experience and graft them together? So we developed an interfaith and interracial, I guess you could say, Seder, where we fused the Jewish tradition and the Caribbean and African-American traditions of the other church. What that did was, I think, gave us a common touch point. It gave us a story that we could share, parallel stories. It gave us the ability to empathize with each other by saying, this is an experience that is important to our own history on both sides of the dialogue. And I thought that that was very valuable for us to be able to see that, because so often it's very hard to envision how the other can be like us and how we can share common narratives and common journeys. So that was a very valuable experience. I'm really glad that I got a chance to participate in that. But to Courtney's point, that was one thing that happened. And I'm unfortunately going to have to report that this year, we're not going to have it again, because our rabbi and the pastor decided, and I think mostly my rabbi, unfortunately, that there was a different way that we wanted to do the Seder this year, that we didn't want to do it again. And I was like, what a missed opportunity. So this brings me to what Courtney was referencing, that just dialogue isn't enough. That when you do something like that, it's a nice event. It's enjoyable to participate in, but it can really end up being reduced to being performative rather than transformative if you just drop it right there.
Thank you, Laura. And I will move on to Menazza.
Thanks. So, I mean, part of what my center does is interreligious training, and we've done quite a few of them. And actually one of them, I think James is on the line, but he was at one of them. And one of the things that I want to say, and this is just sort of a learning lesson, is that discomfort is very real in interreligious training and interfaith dialogue, because if you are, and we've done it with evangelical Christians, and we've done it with Sunnis and Shias, and we've done it in all kinds of ways where you're really bringing unlikely partners to the table. And so when you do that, it's really important, because you realize that, say for me, for example, as a Muslim, Christ is not my salvation, right? But that's really the core of Christianity. So how do I speak to you? And those questions become really important, because you start to understand not just the commonalities, but the core theological differences that have to be addressed in that. The second thing is interfaith dialogue also makes you look at intra-faith racism in a hard way. There are people that are, I mean, if you go to Harlem here in New York, where I am, almost all of the mosques on the Upper West Side are Black. And if you go to, you know, a little bit lower down, you have South Asian, there's a socioeconomic reality of that as well. So I think interfaith, and when we've brought those communities together in the past, before COVID, where we would work with all different kinds of mosques and bring them together, it really shows that there is not just this racial problem, but also the fact that there is a socioeconomic issue in these faith communities. So when, you know, I'm just one Muslim in the world of 1.7 billion Muslims, and I don't represent them. And I think that is really important in interfaith dialogue, because I think that becomes whitewashed when we say, oh, you know, I believe in the same God as you, and then let's move along. No, that's not how it works. So I think that is, for me, the cornerstone of the work that we do at HCI at Manhattan College. Thank you.
Thank you, Menazza. And Maureen, please bring it home.
So it was very interesting when I did this research on my family. I found at least one example of ecumenical, if not interfaith, certainly ecumenical cooperation among white Catholics with different white Protestants in keeping Black people out of neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Ironically, Laura, I found this out, and I'm just sharing this with you now. This was the Jesu Parish in North Philadelphia, only a few blocks from the original home of your synagogue of Adith Jeshurun. Before it moved out to the suburbs, it was right there in the same neighborhood. So we have examples of how effective in the wrong direction interfaith cooperation can be. So if we were to flip that script and think about how powerful people of different faith traditions coming together precisely in the context of their faith tradition to work for racial justice, I do think that there is untold power in that. I also want to add that I think it's really important for white Christians to do this work, because we have to name that white supremacy in the United States is actually white Christian supremacy. In fact, we were just talking about this in class this week, that it's white Christian supremacy, and white Catholics do need to put ourselves in places where our whiteness and our Christianness become more evident to us. And that's really hard, as people said in the chat, to do in predominantly white Christian or white Catholic communities. But it's important for us to do that. But I think that two things before we can do that work, or a thing that we would need to do before we do that work, and then a recommendation I have on how we could do that work, especially to try to answer the good question that came in the chat. we need to do the work. And here I'm talking to white Christians who are joining us today. We need to do the work to become, allow ourselves to become vulnerable enough and sit with our own stories. Again, we were talking about Buddhism in class today, to sit with our own stories of complicity in our white Christianness constructing anti-Blackness. And not to do that again in a way of shaming, but in a way of liberating ourselves from all of the normal emotional reactions we have when confronted with that reality and with that history. The shame, the guilt, the defensiveness. And if we don't do that good internal work, then we can't show up as whole people. And we need resources from other traditions to do that work. So today we were talking about Black feminist Buddhism and the resources that can come from Black feminist Buddhists with sitting with the dynamics of oppression in our realities as a way of liberating us in some ways from those realities. So we need to be in interfaith context, to be heightened, to have a heightened sense of our white identities and our Christian identities, which are so hard to put our fingers on in our predominantly white and Christian contexts. And then we need other resources from other traditions to help us do the deep spiritual work of healing our own selves in some ways.
Thank you so much. I just feel like there's an awful lot to digest and chew on there. And we're going to give our participants another moment in breakout rooms. And I guess I'm very struck by kind of the intersection of Courtney's mention of the importance of interfaith experiences, not just the talking, but the doing and the relationship building, and the stories and wisdom of all the panelists that have reinforced that. And also, I think what I heard you saying just now, Maureen, was that sense of discomfort comes when we are willing to step into vulnerable spaces, even within ourselves, but in relationship with one another. So in light of those, this is the question we have for our small groups this time. And again, Dr. Sartell will place the question in the chat so that you can read it as well as hear it. What have you learned from your experiences of engaging with people from different faith traditions and worldviews that might help us to work toward racial justice and healing? Again, what have you learned from your experiences of engaging with people from different faith traditions and worldviews that might help us to work toward racial justice and healing? And again, we'll be in breakout rooms for maybe a little less than 10 minutes to sort of catch up with ourselves. And again, please bring back a question or a highlight from your discussion. Thank you so much. Great. So Maureen will give a brief introduction to a segment of a gathering that happened in June of 2020, and then we will watch in the streaming together. Maureen? Oops, you're muted.
I think yeah, we go. So I think you saw the first happen, Christy.
Well, this is going to be the panel that starts with Christy Kelly. Okay.
Got it. You've seen the first little bit, and Christy generously introduced that to you with Brother Ernest Miller. So the section that you're going to watch now asks the way in which intersectionality is a dimension of racism in the United States. And by that, we mean the ways in which our many different identities intersect around experiences of race. In other words, not all people experience race in the same way. Not all peoples of color experience race in the same way. And so the people who are going to help unpack that idea are Dr. Christy, and now of course I'm forgetting Christy's last name. Help me, Christy.
Dr. Christy Kelly.
Dr. Christy Kelly from Lewis, Dr. Hayden Green, who is at Manhattan College, and then Dr. Luisa Osa, who is at LaSalle University. So you're going to hear them talk a little bit about their own experiences, and you can see there is difference among them, among their experiences.
And perhaps Christy, you might respond first, and it's this: in what ways must the Lasallian response to racial justice also address intersectionality of identity? So our call to stand in solidarity with the most vulnerable and marginalized among us requires us to rigorously understand the intersectional structures of oppression that create vulnerability and marginalization. So as we also look to frameworks related to how should Lasallian educators engage in the intersectional insights demanded by the frameworks of Black feminist, Black queer, and reproductive justice frameworks as well. When we think about that intersectionality of identity, how are we called as Lasallians to include that in this movement for Black Lives Matter, for racial justice? It's complicated, so, we can handle it.
Wow. Wow. So I'm going to speak to Lewis in particular, and us having an aspiration of being a space where educational excellence and inclusive excellence is a priority. And not to the exclusion clearly of our all of our institutions, but Lewis is bringing to life this notion, philosophy of being a sanctified zone, right? So the sanctified zone at Lewis requires us to make declarations about acceptance and intolerance for multiple isms, right? There's no prescriptive way to do it, but we declare that at the core, human dignity, right, is something that we respect for all. And so we've got a wonderful statement that many of us on our campus, again, we try to live out to address intersectionality and positionalities of all that are on our campus, both virtually and physically. So that's my first attempt to address the intersectionality of our positions and so forth. So that's where I'd land. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone? Louisa, please. Thank you.
That's a big question, so I'm going to kind of reel it back in the sense that I think we need to address the contradictions in the Lasallian and in the broader Catholic world. So for those who read the Access Journal, that I wrote an article about the massive role the Catholic Church played in racializing slavery in the Americas, and that foundation set off the racialized systemic racism in institutions that we still see today. And so when we're talking about, our institutions being anti-racist, it rings hollow if that's never in the discussions as Maureen, because we're at the same university, we talk about that racial justice, social justice, racial justice, social justice, and never is it brought up, well, we have a huge role that we played in starting all of this and continuing to support these systems. And so if that's not addressed, it's the other things like Christy's saying, on the one hand, you're saying you're making these statements, you're creating these zones, but at the core's rotten, you can't really do that. So you have to address your role, start figuring out
what you can do immediately, as we're all saying, to begin to dismantle that, and then, to truly create inclusive environments that go beyond statements. Because if the ideology and the rhetoric is contradictory to the statements the universities are putting out, where are you really?
And to Louisa's point, I read just recently, we can't eliminate something that we don't know how to identify or won't identify. We can't identify something that we don't call out and say what it is. So to that exact point, we got to name it and call it out.
And there's also a kind of danger in living in the past, right? So we can call it out, and we can make we can identify how the certain institutions have been complicit in the institutional racism and racialization of slavery. But we also need to call out the fact that if they want to, the Catholic Church and Catholic institutions can make real dents in this work right now. Right. So whether we are talking about political influence that the Catholic Church has over this country, over and all across the world, or we talk about actually funding business zones in disenfranchised areas so that there are actual there's actual industry and jobs that are created in disenfranchised neighborhoods, or creating schools that are not European based, right? That come from a curriculum that is completely decentralized from a European sensibility. Those are things that can happen tomorrow. Right. And so when we start to talk about what the role of the Catholic Church and the Catholic institutions are, it's not about the statements. We're past the statements. It's not about painting murals. We're past the murals. It's not about a speaker program here and a speaker program there. We are past that. It's about real actionable items that will make differences in dismantling the systems that exist and that they were complicit in creating.
To anyone watching our stream, we're just going to bring those small groups back shortly. I hope you found the reflections of these speakers a good addition to the wisdom you've been hearing today. We'll be continuing in just one moment.
Being recorded.
I believe everybody is back with us, and we hope that the conversation in your small groups continue to enrich your experience at this forum. Just a reminder to facilitators to please place your question or the highlight of your conversation in the chat so that we can bring that to our panelists to continue the conversation. So we're just waiting for people to post their questions, and so Wow, some really great questions, I feel like. And as always, hard to choose among them. But I feel like if it's okay with everybody, I'd like to go back to this idea of discomfort, because I feel like small group number 2 poses, how do we promote authentic togetherness? And I think that goes back to the issue of building authentic relationship, really choosing, sometimes being uncomfortable or vulnerable in order to build these essential relationships that will help us walk toward greater understanding and dismantling of anti-Blackness. So would one of our panelists like to begin in offering their reflections? And you're welcome to grab any snippet of a different question if another one is striking you. But that is still feeling important to me, and would love to hear further reflections from our panel on that question.
I can start.
Thanks.
Christy. So I'm looking at the chat questions, and I'm also looking at people asking about social media, interfaith work. I mean, one of the things is that, do we have access to other people of faith? That's the first question. Because we can't really have dialogue and understanding without having access or contact or intimacy, in a sense, right? So I was raised in Europe with being very intimate with Jews and Christians and Hindus. And then I went to different places like the Middle East, and there were no Jews and Hindus. So I was, intimate more with the Christians and the Muslims. So these things change, but I always had this sort of affinity for people of all faiths because I had that experience of having a friendship or a memory with my Russian Orthodox friend in London, going to Hanukkah, or going to a Catholic school, and going to mass, but sitting in the back of the church. So these memories and this kind of intimacy with other faiths were really very enriching, very different, and also gave me a critical lens about my own Muslimness and Islam, and that indeed there were other people outside of me that believed in completely different things that had no relevancy in my house, like Jesus Christ, right? I mean, Jesus is a beloved prophet, but there were no statues. And being in Europe, you see churches and you see this beautiful architecture and you see images of Mary and Jesus, which you just don't see in your own household. So that juxtaposition was really helpful. And what I'm trying to say is, no, of course you can't travel the world to experience that, is that perhaps we enter into different ways of being and places that we would not necessarily go. And I think that changes the way we think of faith and others, and also in terms of our own racial perception of the world. And I think experience without contact about another religion is completely empty. And I think that's how I would respond to looking at this discomfort. I mean, it's not comfortable being the only Muslim in a classroom, just like it's not comfortable being the only Black girl in the classroom. And those experiences I have had, and what to do with those experiences and understand them as a person of faith or a person of color. Thank you.
Thanks, Courtney, for continuing that. And thank you, Menazza, for your thoughts.
I have something I could contribute also. I do think that we have to construct opportunities for people of different faith traditions to interact with each other, to do things where they learn from each other, experience another person, and there's a face and a human that goes with this other faith tradition. And I just hearken back to something that happened when I first came to LaSalle, when Pope Francis was visiting, and we had an interfaith pilgrimage from LaSalle. We walked from LaSalle to the Benjamin Franklin Parkway where the pontiff was going to speak. And along the way, we stopped at places that represented all the different faith traditions. We started out with a Muslim call to prayer. We stopped at a synagogue. We stopped at an AME church. We stopped at a Catholic cathedral. And at each point, someone from that faith tradition had something to say about the journey that we were on. And I came away from that just feeling so part of a multi-faith community. It was a wonderful experience. I think we need to create things like that for our students and faculty and staff so that we do have that understanding and human connection with each other's traditions.
Thank you, Laura. Courtney, would you like to offer some thoughts?
I would. I think that it's really important as well for us to begin to interrogate this concept of comfort, particularly from our various religious vantage points. As a Christian, I'm thinking about comfort, and I'm thinking about the example of Jesus. And I don't at any point see Jesus seeking comfort. In fact, I'm often seeing Jesus do those things that make him uncomfortable. I'm also thinking about his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? That if you can pass this cup from me, but at the end of the day, your will be done. And I think about that from the perspective of kenosis, right? So kenosis is the self-emptying of Jesus's divinity that enables him to become enfleshed so that he can do his soteriological or salvific work in the world. When we think about kenosis, one of the things that womanist theologians often think through is kenosis as the idea of the relinquishment of privilege, right? The relinquishment of privilege. Certainly Jesus as a divine character has all manner of privilege, but as we watch Jesus do what Jesus does on earth, most of that privilege is given up, right? Whether we're talking about Jesus's glory, the Shekinah glory, whether we're talking about Jesus being born in a manger, you know, in animal food and animal fecal matter. I mean, this is not necessarily dignified, and this is most certainly not privileged. Yet it seems that my white brothers and sisters believe that comfort is their birthright. And so I wonder what happens when we begin to think not from our human perspectives, not from our racial perspectives, but from the perspective of our faith, right? I'm thinking about the scripture that says that as we are transformed, we put on Christ, almost like new clothing, right? And we operate in a different way. I'm interested also, I would love for Menazza to tell me a little bit about how that might translate in the Muslim tradition. But essentially moving away from what we understand to be the human dynamic, right? The human dynamics for interaction, and to begin to interrogate this notion of privilege, because comfort is a privilege. But in addition to that, when we're talking about how to make ourselves uncomfortable, right? Jesus often went to the other side, right? And in doing so, he was able to interact with those who were not Jewish, right? Those who were considered Gentiles, those who were considered unclean, and the kinds of bonds, relationships, and testimonies that become possible as a result. And so I definitely think that Laura is exactly correct, that we constantly need to be seeking ways to be in relationship or encounter others in an embodied fashion, because when we do that and when we make ourselves uncomfortable in encountering the other, we more fully understand ourselves, right? I remember when I was a divinity student at Duke Divinity, I went to Mississippi and worshiped with a white church and worked with a white church for the summer. And in it, I never felt more Baptist and I never felt more Black, right? But I also never felt more connected to my comrade, Christina, who was a white girl who was placed in a Black church. And so in living together and sharing meals and talking about our experiences, we developed a kinship that was unrivaled, right? And I see that happen over and over again as I engage in other communities and learn more about myself. And as I believe it was Maureen said, you know, taking strategies from these other races, these other faiths to figure out what the best way forward might be.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And I'm going to transition to our closing segment, but I just want to lift up the question that came up from group 10 and we're just going to leave it for now, but I think it might help to shape some of these final comments that our panelists are going to make. They say, Maureen O'Connell and others highlighted family prioritizing comfort over engaging in racial justice. And that goes to your comments just now, Courtney, about that privilege of comfort, right? How can we help students and ourselves reflect on our own familial and social choices of where we live, we eat, we go for fun, etc.? How do we unpack the implicit biases within our actions to reflect ourselves and move our reflection into more just facing actions in our lives? And that, to me, is exactly where this last question hopes to take us. There is obviously a great deal more to say. That said, we'd like to give our panelists the last word to issue a call to action for our LaSallian campuses and the rest of our brothers and sisters who have chosen to join us from beyond the LaSallian family. I'd ask panelists to keep their comments to about a minute, as painful as that may be, so that each panelist has that moment to share and we don't go over time, so that we are respecting our participants' schedules. And so the question is this, which again, very much intertwines with what Group 10 posted. As members of LaSallian campus communities, what is essential interfaith work we can begin or deepen in terms of responding to anti-Black racism? It's an enormous question for a very brief time. And I know we did not put an order, but I'll mix it up, and let's start with Laura this time.
Oh, goodness. Wow. I don't know how to really summarize that in 1 minute, to be honest. But I think that having more dialogue such as this is a good place to start. But I always say we need to do something experiential too. We need to have the conversation. We need to then figure out how we can energize people to go back to their own faith traditions and say, let's have some self-examination, again, without shame, but just do something with that, bring it back. I think also we need to have a few more experiential interfaith activities on the campus, just so that we can all get to know each other and start to have enough comfort to be able to actually have a dialogue while being uncomfortable.
Thank you so much. Menazza, do you mind if we go to you next?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about this question, but I want to say that first we must listen on our campuses. I think that sometimes we just don't listen and just do and act. That's the first thing. I mean, listen to the hallways, listen to your students, and listen to the non-Catholics. And that is the first move for interfaith. The second thing I want to say is that, and this is a practical point, we cannot be a LaSallian interfaith campus without all of the schools participating. That means the School of Business, that means the School of Engineering, that means the School of Science. I mean, all of the schools. And I think that it's very comfortable for us LaSallians to say we're doing the work when only it's being done in the School of Liberal Arts or Humanities or whatever school schools that you are in. That is a very essential, important thing that must come across, because it's not just a corner of the campus that's interfaith or talking about anti-Blackness. It has to be the whole campus. And that is the way we can perhaps have a conversation. And that is a way to get our students involved, that, my engineering or my science or my business professor cares as much about Ramadan as my religious studies professor. And that is what's important, I think, that I can say in this 1 minute.
Thank you, Menazza. Courtney?
1 minute, here we go. So I think I want to return to what I said in the beginning, because I think that it translates. So when we think about our institutions, we have to be thinking about what kinds of resources are being placed into celebrating what cultures and what faiths, right? Are we making our Muslim brothers and sisters seem like an afterthought, particularly in the season of Ramadan? An email came by and, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to creating a hospitable environment for those who are not Christian, right? So first and foremost, we have to make the space hospitable so that everyone can contribute, right? So, and that begins with celebrating everyone's cultural and religious diversity and giving it the kind of oomph that we would to the Christian white traditions, right? Essentially what I'm saying is that we need to decenter whiteness in our curriculums, in our student life, in our social life, in our community life. It needs to be decentralized. But then we also need to take a look at our images and iconography. Who is being celebrated and who is present in our brochures, when certain celebrations and holidays come up. Is there any kind of imagery present so that, again, we can expand our moral imaginations, right? Images are incredibly important to that. Symbol is incredibly important to that. And from that, I believe the ethics of an institution changes. Once we begin to grapple with things within our moral imagination and imagine other possibilities, our ethics, the things we do, the things we value, the things that we perceive as mattering, change as a result.
Thank you so much. And Maureen, if you could please bring it to conclusion.
We go 1 minute. I'm going to say three words. I think we need 3 ideas. We need to tell the truth in our institutions. We really do. We need to do deep histories and tell the honest truth about the histories of white supremacy in our Catholic institutions and the way that has impacted people of color and the way that has impacted people of other traditions. We have to tell the truth, not to shame, but to learn and grow. The second thing, to Group 10's question, which I love, all of our institutions are located in a particular place, in a particular space. It has its own history, has its own culture, has its own people. Let's figure that out. I take my students on a social justice walking tour of the neighborhood. So we learn the space where we are. Maybe we don't have to worry about all those questions in all these other parts of our lives, or we should do that. But certainly we could be aware of place in our own institutions. And lastly, I'm going to say, I think we need religious dialogue. In predominantly Catholic contexts, we need to recognize that Catholic does not mean white. Christian does not mean white. So there's a lot of work we can do even within Christian communities, even within our Catholic communities, to engage the difference that is there and grow and learn from that difference.
Thank you so much, Maureen, and thank you to all our panelists. If our participants can spare 2 more minutes, I just have a few words of gratitude and we'd like to close with prayer. If you can't, we totally understand. But we're just super grateful to all 4 of our panelists, Dr. Freidy, Dr. Bryant, Dr. Frank, and Dr. O'Connell, for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, your experiences, your stories with us. We're just very, very grateful. I'd also again like to thank my colleagues, Mr. Chris Swanson and Dr. Elizabeth Sartell, for their support throughout. And to all of you for choosing to spend time with us today and engaging in these important conversations. This cannot be the end of the conversation on any of our campuses or in any of the spaces in which we move and live and work. And so before departing, we would very much like to end with a brief closing reflection. Our beloved colleague, Frances Sweeney, Dr. Frances Sweeney, will share that, and then we will bid you adieu.
Thank you. And thank you to our facilitators as well, especially the student facilitators who volunteered their time. I invite us to breathe and to be in gratitude for this courageous conversation. As Brother Ernest Miller reminds us, LaSallian education must move from a pleasant poetics of charity to a prophetic praxis of hope. Thank you for joining us today, Brother Ernest. May the examples we have heard move our hearts and hands with hope. May we continue to move in the spirit of humility and with the discomfort that is necessary to confront issues of white Christian privilege and comfort with hope. May we be active witnesses and agents with the courage to call in, to do the work of justice, and to continue to transform ourselves and each other. May we listen with love. Together and by association, may we engage and engage again with critical and deep learning, tell our truth, learn the space, act with conviction. Together and by association, may we realize our gifts and graces and how our different religious traditions and experiences can be arms for justice as much as they have been instruments of harm. Together and by association, called to touch hearts, may we affirm the authentic image of God present in each of us. Together and by association. St. John Baptist de La Salle, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts forever. Amen.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your partnership, Francis. Be well to all. We are grateful for you, and let us press on toward justice together. Thank you.